Another solemn anniversary has come and gone, and still no prospect for peace in Gaza. As parties gather in Sharm el Sheikh with proposals on the table, controversial U.S. envoys arrive to take part. President Trump wants a deal quickly, but with no tangible results in the 9 days since his plan was announced. Is Israel's onslaught set to continue indefinitely? I'm Andrea Sankey, and this is the Newsmakers. The October 7th Hamas attack 2 years ago unleashed the annihilation of Gaza. Almost 70,000 people have been killed, countless others injured, and the psychological and emotional damage are unimaginable. Now, to most, it seems obvious that the violence would have to be stopped, not just under international law, but under growing global public pressure. Still, it continues, rendering international law obsolete in the case of Israel and Palestine. Here's a look.
2 years after October 7, the world stands divided between remembrance and reckoning. In Israel, memorials marked the Hamas-led attacks that killed more than 1,200 people. Across continents, thousands marched, not in silence, but in defiance, calling out the devastation of Gaza, where health officials say more than 67,000 people have been killed since Israel's offensive began. As the world marked the October 7 anniversary, Israeli strikes continued across the enclave. In Egypt, negotiators reconvened, trying once again to turn global calls for peace into action. President Trump's envoys, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, joined mediators from Egypt and Qatar as talks focused on a lasting ceasefire. Hamas insists any deal must include a full withdrawal and an end to the war, not another pause. Inside Gaza, hospitals run without power, and families wait in the dark for a peace that never comes.
When the world marks October 7, it should rather remember the motive behind the October 7 attack. 77 years of occupation, injustice, killing and displacement. They should look for solutions for the Palestinian people.
At the United Nations, those words echo in a chamber long paralysed by politics. Once again, the Secretary-General appealed for an end to the violence through his spokesperson.
He said today, with even greater urgency, release the hostages unconditionally and immediately, end the suffering for all, put an end to the hostilities in Gaza, in Israel, and the region right now.
Beyond those halls, the message was louder. From London to Mexico City, protesters demand an end to what they call collective punishment. Their voices rise against the same silence that stalls diplomacy.
I would say that every day has been a heartbreaking day for the people of Gaza. Every day there have been more and more deaths, more and more children killed. I believe that peace was never the objective of the Israeli government, but rather total extermination of the population of Gaza. I believe that anyone who today does not stand up and say end to this genocide will have to carry that weight for the rest of their life.
Global outrage is rising, yet the world's most powerful institutions remain frozen. And as the bombs still fall, the question is no longer how the world remembers October 7, but how long it can ignore what followed.
Well, joining me now to further explore what has ensued in the years since October 7th are from Washington, Palestinian author and journalist Laila el Haddad, from al-Khir in the occupied West Bank, member of the Knesset with the Democratic Front for Peace and Equality, Ofer Kasif, and from London, Ontario, Professor Emeritus of Law at Western University and former UN Special Rapporteur on Palestine, Michael Link. Thank you all so much for being with me. Laila, in the aftermath of the October 7th anniversary, we're looking at these talks now underway in Egypt. So far, not even the most temporary ceasefire has emerged to stop the killing or stop the bombs from dropping. It's been a week and a half since this plan was announced, yet when I spoke to our correspondent yesterday in Gaza, he said there is hope. People are hopeful about this process. Do you feel the same?
I'll begin by echo what my own cousins and family who remain in Gaza, and about half of them remain in Gaza City in the north, cut off yet again from the south, to honor their voices as well and their experience. And I think that we are inherently a hopeful people. In the words of Emil Habibi, we're pess optimistic. I think one has nothing else to cling to but hope at this point, right? Especially if you've endured the genocide of the past 2 years. That said, they haven't seen any changes on the ground, at least the ones in the city. I just spoke with them a short while ago, and were telling me that it's just nonstop bombardment and the use of these sort of armored UEVs to destroy buildings that are going around in the city, and artillery fire is relentless. But I think that, I think that the fear is as follows. Of course, we want the genocide to end. We want the bombardment to end. But, not to what end. I think the fear is what happens next.
Absolutely.
Will it be a return to the status quo pre-October 7th, where Gaza was under a blockade? I think there's the nervousness about this.
Sure. But Laila, let me ask you this.
Other than sacrificed here, of course, that hasn't been already.
I'm so sorry. We have a delay with your connection. But other than hope being the only option, what substance do you see on the table now in Egypt that makes you believe something can come out of these talks?
Well, I think I want to kind of divide it into two. I think the hope for me stems not necessarily from these governments or these negotiations per se, although ultimately you need a state intervention to put an end to this, but rather in what I have seen over the past 2 years. Hope in people, hope in movements around the world, hope in the changing discourse and what Gaza has exposed. I think that's where I see hope the most, to be honest with you. But with regards to the actual negotiations, I think this is probably the one that has the most buy-in from the most governments. But of course, governments are driven by power and interest, so whatever that means. But in that sense, it has the most buy-in from more power players, I would say, both regional and international.
Okay. Mike, if you can take a more kind of clinical analysis, if that is possible. Tell us if you believe anything substantial can come from these talks, if there is any real middle ground to be found, because you do have Hamas demanding a full Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, which seems fair, and then Israel, of course, demanding the release of every hostage, which many argue would leave Hamas with absolutely no leverage going forward. So again, what real substance is there to move this process toward a peaceful end?
I think the chances of at least a temporary ceasefire with exchange of Israeli hostages for Palestinian detainees is probably high. I think there's a lot of energy that's pushing towards that. But whether or not this is going to create a permanent ceasefire, let alone any path for the reconstruction of Gaza or a Palestinian state, I think the chances are very low with respect to this. This plan, this Trump peace plan, needs clarity, not ambiguity, but it's full of ambiguity. It needs explicit timelines for agreements to occur and for action to take place. And beyond the release of Israeli hostages and Palestinian detainees, there appear to be no timelines with regards to this. There needs to be a credible and swift pathway to a Palestinian state, entirely absent from the peace plan. This needs to be grounded in international law and UN resolutions that have any chance at all of success. Again, entirely absent from this.
Michael, I have to ask you, because there are a number of people out there, Trump critics in particular, saying the reason he's doing this and pushing this is because he wants that Nobel Peace Prize. And some people think that's a kind of a joke. They laugh at it. But in his mind, do you believe it's a real factor here, that this is why the pressure is on from his administration to get something done?
Trump, when he came into power in last January, had promised he was going to end the wars in Ukraine and in Gaza within a couple of days. He said it was all within reach. Here we are over 8 months later, and neither war has had any sign of it wind up ending. So I think, first of all, his ego it must be on the line with respect to his failed promises to take action regarding this. Yes, perhaps the Nobel Peace Prize, as he brags about, he deserves. I think he's going to wake up on Friday morning a very disappointed person when the Peace Prizes are announced for this year, and I can't imagine that there will be a Peace Prize for him in the future. Keep in mind that the Nobel Peace Prize selection committee has been burnt twice before with respect to the 1979 Peace Prizes given to Sadat and Begin, which didn't produce a permanent peace in the Middle East, and the same thing with respect to 1994, when the Peace Prize was given to Rabin, Arafat, and Shimon Peres, and that didn't produce a Palestinian state or permanent peace either. So the chances of him getting a Peace Prize, I think, are very low, and he may be the only person in the world that doesn't realize that.
Okay. Ofer, you, meanwhile, are in the West Bank as we speak. You're on a break from your work in the Knesset, but I have to ask you this because according to a very recent study, Israelis' trust in government is down very significantly. Some 2/3 actually say they do not have confidence in the Israeli government at all. Is the tide finally turning then against Netanyahu and his right-wing coalition and what Israel is doing in Gaza?
First, with your permission, I would like to explain it. I'm here in the village of Khir in the West Bank, occupied West Bank, in the area of Mesafer Yatta. This village was attacked time and time again by settlers and by Jewish settlers, terrorists, under the auspices and cooperation of the occupation forces. Yesterday, again, 150 olive trees were uprooted by them. The head of the village was arrested and released later. My friend Khalil, the brother of Awad Adalin, was murdered by a settler 2 months ago, and the settler was set free, by the way, got back his arms, and still walking by here in the village as the master. That's the situation in the West Bank as well. We should remember that in addition to the genocide in Gaza, there's an ethnic cleansing going on in the West Bank, and villages and communities are under a continuous attack by the occupation forces and the settlers, which are combined. There's a symbiosis between those two. We must be aware and struggle against that too. That's the reason I'm here, to support the people of Khir. Now, as to your question, it is very clear for quite a long time that the vast majority of the people in Israel want to finish with what they call war. I refuse to call it a war because that's a genocide, and there are huge differences between the two, not only philosophically and theoretically, but also legally and practically. So there is a genocide going on in Gaza, not a war. But the majority of Israelis, according to the polls, close to 80% want to finish with that war, as it were. Now, it is true that for the most of them, not all of them, it is true that for most of them, the reason for ending that war, as it were, is the fate of the hostages and Israeli soldiers. And only a minority, like myself and my friends, do care about the fate of the thousands and millions of Palestinians as well. But still, it seems that there is a change. The government is hated. Netanyahu as a person is hated. Nobody almost trusts him and the government. You can see the change of the tide. I can give you one example, which in my view is crucially important. in the demonstrations which take place every weekend and throughout the week against the continuation of the genocide and against the government and Netanyahu himself, there is a bloc, our bloc, the bloc against the genocide and occupation. And in the beginning, we were a relatively tiny minority. Now you can see that we constitute, I wouldn't say a majority, but a huge bloc. When we stand with pictures of Gazan children who were killed by Israel, in the beginning we were just few dozens of us. Now you can see across the country thousands. And so that indicates that there is a change. And of course, you can see many others who talk about the genocide and call to stop it, including a petition by ex-generals, 600 of them, who signed a petition and explicitly refer to the situation as ethnic cleansing and war crimes, including Moshe Bogi Ya'alon, who was the chief of staff and Minister of Defense in Netanyahu's government. He refers to the situation in Gaza as a war crime and crimes against humanity. So you can see a change.
Right. So, I mean, many have argued that if anything is going to truly change, the pressure will have to come from within. So, Laila, I mean, in that, has the aftermath of October 7th actually shown us that there is really not much place anyway for international law anymore if major powers can circumvent it no matter how grave the violations are?
Absolutely. I think if it's shown us anything, it's put into question the applicability, the legitimacy, the nature of the rules-based order. Gaza has been a touchstone for that in that regard, as well as the collapse of, the myth of, or the hegemony of the West over the question of morality and the myth of Western humanity. I think you're seeing these seismic shifts that, we're only beginning to reflect on, and in retrospect, we'll look back and see this as a pivotal moment in that regard. That's not to say that the law has no place, of course, and I think it's just one tool, though, in the toolbox, right? As people worldwide continue to speak out and advocate and try to put an end to this horror, there is somewhat of a rule. It's a little bit of a leverage, right? And otherwise, Netanyahu and his ilk wouldn't be so concerned, and Trump and others wouldn't be trying to sanction and so on different officials, whether they be UN officials, ICC, and so on and so forth. So it certainly does play a role, but Gaza has definitively exposed that double standard and what benefit it has and utility if it's only serving the systems that created it.
Yeah. I mean, Michael, just quickly, international law, I guess, has proven a massive failure in the case of Israel and Palestine, but there's still something to redeem from it. I mean, basically, it's better than nothing, and it's all we have.
Oh, look, exactly. The international law is our, if you like, our international value system. It reflects the secular agreement that virtually everybody has bought into, states and political leaders. So on that grounds, it's important to defend. And the other advantage with respect to thinking about this in terms of international law is that international law and UN resolutions are so clear as to what Israel's transgressions have been over the last 58 years and over the last almost 80 years. And what should be done with respect to that. The answers lie in these UN resolutions and international law. If only there was the international political resolve to be able to enforce this.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, as somebody has said, international law in the Middle East is closer to power than it is to justice. And this sense of international law for thee, but not for me, remains prevalent among the global north. And unless and until we're able to enforce this through resolutions of the United Nations and through the two international courts in The Hague, I suspect that power will continue to rule over justice when it comes to Israel and Palestine.
Yeah, power and money. I'm going to ask you about this, Michael, because, Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, they've arrived now as pretty much the chief envoys for the U.S. And in Jared Kushner, you have someone who has massive business interests in both the Gulf and with Israel. The Wall Street Journal actually just said the deal that Kushner brokered for the Saudi takeover of a U.S. video game company was, they called it the largest private buyout in history that paves the way for major Saudi investment in the United States. I don't have time to get into the business interests with Israel as well, and of course his very personal relationship with Benjamin Netanyahu. But I mean, come on, Mike, can this not at least be called out as just a conflict of interest here?
Look, on both sides, I think you're correct with respect to this. The United States has always played a one-sided mediation role, and this has never been more evident than during the time of Trump 1 and now Trump 2.0 with respect to this, and mixing political interests with financial interests on the parts of his son-in-law and obviously with Mr. Witkoff as well. But let's look at the other side of this equation as well. There hasn't been a time that I recall over the last 50 years when Arab political leaders on the question of Palestine have been more politically irrelevant with respect to this. If those countries which established political relationships and strong investment relationships with Israel could not break those during the course of a 2-year genocide in Gaza, I don't know what would compel them to act in an honorable way consistent with law and morality.
Yeah, Ofer, on that, speaking of Arab political leaders, I mean, you say you're there, you're standing in solidarity with the people, but where is the leadership? Is there something fundamental missing here to help end this aggression and this miserable status quo that we've seen for decades now of oppression? Who do you want to see really emerge from this? Because, and please speak to the fact that obviously Israel wants Hamas out of the equation. That's fine. But where is the Arab leadership where you are right now?
First of all, let's not forget Israel actually wanted Hamas in power. We all remember that Netanyahu not only said explicitly already in 2019, and Smotrich himself said in 2015, and I quote, that Hamas is an asset and the Palestinian Authority is a burden. They wanted Hamas in order to prevent any moving forward towards peace, which necessitates, of course, the liberation of the Palestinian people and the statehood of the Palestinian people. So I wouldn't, jump to conclusion that they just changed their mind and they don't want something like Hamas to still be in power. But as to my own view, absolutely, I think that we are all disappointed, to say the least, of everybody who is involved, all regimes and governments that are involved, whether it's the so-called Western ones, who for 2 years have been, ignoring the terrible atrocities and the genocide and ethnic cleansing that Israel has been carrying out. But at the same time, Arab regimes that haven't done anything, and they could, to stop it immediately. I recall something that very interesting and eloquent that Mahatma Gandhi once said. He was asked during the British occupation and rule of India, he was asked in an interview what he thought about British civilization. And he said, I think it's a wonderful idea. So I may say the same about the West and unfortunately about the Arab regimes as well. What do I think about those civilizations? I think those might be a wonderful idea. They must change their attitude. And they must change their attitude not only rhetorically, but in practice. And that means to act against those who are guilty in atrocities and war crimes and crimes against humanity and stop them. They have the power, they don't have the will, because apparently it's not with their own, don't serve their own interests. If there is a hope, and here I would like to embrace what the first speaker said, sorry, I cannot remember the name, is that if there is a hope, it's the peoples. The peoples around the globe, we see them now. We see them rise. We see them calling. We see the flotillas, for instance. They must continue, because if they put more pressure on their governments in the so-called West and in the Middle East, etc., then we may see a change. to the better.
Okay. Very unfortunately, we are completely out of time because, Michael, I think I saw you sigh at one point. I'm not sure if you had a comment, and I would have loved to come back to you, but I can't believe how quickly the time does go, and the clock against us as always. So I'll have to leave it there. I'd like to thank all three of you so much, really, for being with me, and we'll be talking to you again in the very near future. So that is all for this edition of the Newsmakers. Remember, you can follow us on social media, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.